Gives me great pleasure to welcome today our keynote speaker, Mr. Carl Gershman, a very, very dear friend of mine personally for the last 20 years, and also a great friend and a great supporter of CSID since its founding also 20 years ago. Carl has been, he's of course the president of the National Endowment for Democracy. He travels all over the world. NED works all over the world with programs in all the countries. But he has visited Tunisia many times. NED works in the Middle East and North Africa and the Muslim world many times. So he knows a lot of our issues, and he is very familiar with the issues that we are talking about in this conference. And he has spoken, of course, at previous conferences in the past about the issue of Islam and democracy and democracy in the Muslim world and so on. So it really is a great pleasure to welcome Carl Gershman as a keynote speaker to our 20th annual conference today. And Carl will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll have maybe 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A if you have any questions for Carl. So, Carl, welcome, and thank you very much for taking the time and joining us today.
Thank you, Radwan. And it is great to be here, especially at the 20th anniversary conference, and I'm really honored that you invited me to speak on this occasion, give a keynote, and to reflect on some of the lessons that we've learned over the last 20 years. As Radwan said, Ned and I personally have been connected with CSID from the very beginning, when we provided office space for Radwan and his one-person staff, Abdul Al-Kepsi. I think it was after CSID was created in '99, but they lost their office space and they were trying to save some money, so we gave them offices for a few months. And you know, that time was when CSID was founded, it was actually a tough period for NED. Michelle Dunn, who is a member of the NED board, and she knows this because I mentioned it at a retreat that we just had, a board retreat. We had, our appropriator was a fellow from New Hampshire named Senator Judd Gregg, and he would zero the NED out he was the chairman of the Appropriations Committee. He would give us zero money every year, and then we would have to get our budget restored on the floor, and Senator Lugar helped a lot with that. And, you know, this was a period that Charles Krauthammer, the late writer, called the vacation from history, when people thought that democracy was no longer being contested and that NED was no longer needed. And then came, of course, we commemorated the anniversary yesterday, then came 9/11. And everything changed. We had sent a draft. At the time, we were about to come out with a 5-year strategic plan, and we sent the draft of it to a friend of ours on Senator Gregg's staff, and we had added a section on aiding democracy in the Muslim world. And the staffer looked at it, and he said, "Could you boil that down into a page for me?" Which we did, and he gave it to the senator. And the next thing we knew, the senator was doubling our budget. So that, you know, history had not ended, only the vacation ended, and with the end of the vacation, all of a sudden Ned became relevant again. And I think that story underlines the importance of CSID's mission in building democracy in the Muslim world, and how important that mission is to the security of the United States. And I'm proud to say, as Radwan suggested, that Ned has been working with CSID and supporting CSID for all of these 20 years. And as Radwan knows, we've often been attacked for doing so, and I'm very, very proud of that. I've been asked to talk about some of the lessons that we've learned during this period. So let me highlight a few of them. As we all know, democracy today is being challenged all over the world, and nowhere is the resistance to democracy greater than in the Middle East. But as I think we all know, the battle goes on. It didn't end with the crushing of the uprisings of the Arab Spring everywhere but in Tunisia, and people are still fighting because the status quo is just not viable. The last two Arab barometer surveys report that there is a strong and growing acceptance in the Middle East of democracy as the best type of government. There was another study that was conducted 5 years after the Arab Spring uprisings, and it found that 8 in 10 Arabs believe that democracy is the best system of government, even if they acknowledge that it has a lot of problems and they may have, grievances with it. And the reason, I think, for this is obvious. And this is the first lesson, that people don't like corruption and unaccountable government. They want freedom and respect for their human dignity. And that's why people rose up against, more recently, the Bashir regime in Sudan last December, and then against the Bouteflika regime in Algeria in February. These uprisings are actually part of a larger global trend that found that over the past 5 or 6 years, 10% of the world's governments have changed because of protests and uprisings against corrupt government. Today, the Islamist regime in Iran is an example of a dictatorship whose very survival is being threatened by popular uprisings in cities like Qom and Mashhad that traditionally have been strongholds of the Revolutionary Guard. And in Turkey today, it's another example, since Erdogan's losses in the local elections earlier this year, and especially in the rerun of the Istanbul elections that he insisted upon, represent a stunning defeat that deepens the crisis of his increasingly autocratic regime. Almost a decade after the abortive Arab Spring, the potential for rebellion against repressive and unaccountable rulers in the Middle East is actually as great as ever. But so is the resistance to change, and this is the second lesson. Led by China and Russia, and increasingly by the Gulf states and Iran and other authoritarian regimes, authoritarian countries today are engaged in a concerted effort to contest democracy. They constitute a kind of authoritarian, a de facto authoritarian international. And we saw how this international works earlier this year when Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Egypt and Russia teamed up to try to block a democratic opening in Sudan. And just days after the Bashir stepped down, for example, Saudi Arabia and the UAE pledged $3 billion in aid to the Sudan military that was there, and they've done whatever they could since then to back Hemeti and his militias, but they've been able to work out a compromise there, which I consider to be absolutely remarkable. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have also sought to undermine democracy in Tunisia by stoking grievances and discontent. Radwan has kept me posted on that. And according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, independent journalists that they've spoken with in Tunisia believe that the Gulf money is secretly funding some of the campaigns that are going on right now, even though right now they can't prove that. Multilateral and regional bodies like the Gulf Cooperation Council and the Organization of Islamic States are part of this authoritarian international, with the OIC, for instance, being used by some governments to provide a veneer of religious legitimacy for their authoritarian rule. And according to one analyst, nationalist regimes, long self-defined as secular, have ended up embracing Islam as their identifying brand, trying to find in its tenets political legitimacy that they lack. They don't have it because of their lack. They have never been democratically elected. And we all know, and Radwan has definitely kept me posted on this, that the embassies of the Emirates and other Gulf countries throw their weight around Washington too, and have exorbitant budgets to influence policy and opinion in this town. The authoritarian international needs to be countered by a democratic international or a coalition of democratic governments and organizations committed to defending democracy and the people fighting to achieve it. But I think, as we know, no such coalition exists, and this is the third lesson. The West is largely absent today when it comes to backing democracy in the Middle East. An absence that was reflected, I think, in the warm welcome given to Egyptian President Sisi at the recent G7 meeting in France. As Ann Applebaum wrote recently in the Post, there's a crisis of Western culture, Western values, that manifests itself in the decline in faith in liberal democracy, a loss of confidence in universal human rights, and a collapse in support for all kinds of transnational projects. The bloodied face of this crisis, she wrote, has been seen in the slow, grinding, murderous endgame of the war in Syria that has undermined the West's commitment to genocide prevention and the responsibility to protect. Nowhere has this silence been more deafening than in the case of the cultural genocide that China is now carrying out systematically against the minority Uyghur people, including as much as a quarter of the 11 million people, Uyghurs, now being held in concentration camps. And I might say, by the way, that those who are not in concentration camps have their homes invaded by Han Chinese to propagandize them and to survey them, so that all the 11 million are under attack today. And even worse than the world's silence has been the, frankly, enthusiastic support that Saudi Arabia's Mohammed bin Salman gave to this genocide during his visit to China last February, when he said on state television that it was necessary to defeat terrorism, because that's how the Chinese rationalized their campaign to destroy, and it really is amounting to destroy the Uyghur people. And I urge CSID, I've talked to Radwan about this, I urge CSID to do whatever it can to end the silence in the Muslim world. We were in Malaysia together recently, and we met with Farouk Musa, who's a wonderful guy. I really want him to be connected to CSID. He runs the Islamic Renaissance Front in Malaysia, and he challenged his government and actually had an impact. And therefore, you know, to end the silence of the Muslim world on China's criminalization of the practice of Islam and its effort to destroy the language, culture, and identity of the Uyghur people. I mean, if you have you're not allowed to wear a long beard, you can't wear a hijab and so forth. Those are criminal acts in East Turkestan, Xinjiang today. In any event, the disengagement of the West in the Middle East has encouraged Arab autocrats, particularly Saudi Arabia, to adopt more aggressive policies, which have in turn prompted them to develop an ideological language for sustaining the aggression. From Iraq to Indonesia, Saudi Arabia's Wahhabists and similar extreme ideologues are spreading a rigid, literalistic interpretation of Islam that, according to Ed Hussein in his new book, The Battle of Ideas, is rejected by the majority of Muslims and imposed on them. And so the battle of ideas, he contends, is not between the West and Islam, but it is within the Islamic world. And this is the fourth lesson, that the battle of ideas goes on in the world, in the whole world, between democracy and authoritarianism. It didn't end, as many people thought, with the end of the Cold War. And nowhere is that battle more acute than with respect to the battle within Islam. And the malign influence stems not only from autocratic regimes, of course, but also from the ideological contamination of extremist movements which cannot be defeated by a purely security strategy. A recent study from the Institute for Global Change states that the United Kingdom, for example, spends only 1% of its anti-terrorism budget on countering the ideology driving Islamist violence. And the security analyst John Hanna has written that, and I quote, "The failure to prioritize the ideological as opposed to the military war has been the perennial Achilles heel of U.S. strategy on this question." And no one in the world, in my view, has understood this problem better than Rashid Ghannouchi, who has spoken about this problem at many CSID events, including an annual conference that I attended. And in his keynote address that he delivered last year to the World Movement for Democracy, Radwan's on the steering committee of the World Movement, and the address was delivered on, if I remember correctly, May 9th, and May 8th, and the local elections had just been held on May 6th. And so Ghannouchi was not able to be with us, so Radwan read the address to the assembly, but it was a very, very important address. Ghannouchi explained how groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda have exploited the Arab world's economic and social problems to present themselves as an alternative, making a special appeal to young people. The solution to extremism, he said in this address, is more freedom, not less, more democracy, not less, more debate and dialogue, and more moderate religious teachings that confront the extremist ideology. The 5,300 mosques in Tunisia, he said, are an optimal platform for promoting to a broad and religiously observant audience, a compelling and tolerant religious vision for combating extremist ideologues, as well as for strengthening democratic values and respect for human rights. Religion and democracy, he said, have to work together. And he appealed to the assembled delegates of this global democratic movement as, quote, as leaders of democracy to include religion and religious actors and institutions in all of your efforts and programs. And I want to assure you that the NED is totally committed to this approach and will do whatever it can to amplify moderate religious voices who promote traditional religious beliefs and practices that demonstrate tolerance and respect for pluralism. I know that we're all expectantly awaiting the results of the elections in Tunisia this Sunday, and that you'll be discussing Tunisia this afternoon at the last session of the conference. Many staff from NED and its party institutes are in Tunisia now to support the election process. And a year ago, the NED and its institutes agreed that support for the democratic transition in Tunisia would be our highest shared priority. We are coordinating on this challenge more than on any other issue because so much rests on the successful consolidation of the Arab world's first democracy. There are many critical challenges, none more important than reforming the economy, so that young people will have jobs and hope. And these are challenges that only the Tunisian people can meet, but they need support and solidarity. And we hope that when the world movement for democracy, in a gesture of solidarity, convenes in Tunis a year from now, we will be able to celebrate the continuing resilience of Tunisian democracy. In a memorable essay written almost a half a century ago, the political scientist Dankwart Rostow wrote that democratic resilience emerges from the experience of democracy itself, with its basic practice of multilateral debate. He said, democracy in particular involves a process of trial and error, a joint learning experience. By the way, in the keynote address to the World Movement for Democracy delivered by Amartya Sen in 1999, he made this same point. He called it the constructive function of democracy, how people could learn. It was a learning process. And the first grand compromise, Rostow said, that establishes democracy, if it proves at all viable, is itself a proof of the efficacy of the principle of conciliation and accommodation. That process, with all of its immense difficulties, complexities, and risks, is now underway in Tunisia, and I don't think there is any turning back. Another political scientist, the late Guillermo O'Donnell from Argentina, once wrote in a really brilliant essay that we published in our journal that what he called the Genie of Democracy, which expresses a universal human demand for freedom, recognition, and respect, is now the specter that haunts not just Europe, but the whole world, erupting unexpectedly in countries that seem to be gripped tightly in the authoritarian fist and forcing dictators to pay tribute to it by faking free elections. Though we can't predict, he said, how potent that this genie will turn out to be against the manifold forces against it, and those forces are stronger now than when he spoke these words 12 years ago, we know that the spirit of democracy is with us and that on repeated occasions it has shown how powerfully it can give expression to demands for freedom and for the recognition of human dignity. Those manifold forces, as I said, against democracy are more powerful today than at any time since the end of the Cold War, 3 decades ago. But as O'Donnell said, those who have suffered at the hands of a brutally repressive state know from experience that continuing to hope, even in the face of apparently overwhelming odds, can be an immensely, if sometimes unexpected, force. A force that can even nourish other more specific capacities that may promote improvements in democratic quality. And I think that the principal lesson of the last 20 years is that democracy inspires this hope. It is the reference point for hope, O'Donnell said, and that there's no way to put the genie back in the bottle. And so may CSID's next 20 years be as fruitful as its first. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carl, for an excellent presentation. And now you understand why we have built such a strong relationship with Carl and with Ned, because I think we have shared values and shared goals and objectives. And we have really appreciated the support that we received from Ned and the collaboration for over the last 20 years. So now we're going to take a few questions, if there are any. Not a lot. We have maybe 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes. Yes, Michelle? Do we have a microphone?
Thank you, Carl, for a very interesting talk. I wanted to follow up on the point of the support of the United States, Europe, other democratic nations for democracy and human rights, let's say in the Middle East and in Muslim-majority countries. We know what the situation is now under the current administration, but the problem goes back, as you know. I mean, in my view, the support given to the uprisings of the Arab Spring was very inadequate from the West. And that may have been tied to the financial crisis, et cetera. So it's really been it's been a big problem for a long time. Moving forward, how do you see the possibility of fixing this? Is there a different constellation of democratic actors in the world that could act on this? Is there, presumably including the United States, and in what ways? Are there different ways that we should do it? You have noted the important uprisings in Algeria and Sudan. I mean, what about those cases? Are there ways in which democratic actors in the world, including the United States, can support them far better than we did with the earlier Arab uprisings?
Thanks, Michelle. Look, I think the first step in solving this problem is to have a realistic strategy, a realistic perspective, so that people don't, assume that we're exporting democracy, we're imposing democracy. I mean, democracy is something that has to come from within. And I said this in my talk when I was talking about Tunisia. It has to come from within. It has to be done by the people themselves. But they need help, and the question is, and you have to provide help. So one of the questions we struggle with all the time is, what is the proper division of labor so that, you're not engaging in military intervention, you're not engaging in nation building in a extremely comprehensive way, but you're doing it in a reasonable way. And then what is the division of labor in our own country, for example, between our government and an institution like our own? Here we are, we're funded by the Congress. And I might say that the Congress, as things get worse in the United States, the Congress supports us more. I mean, that's just the attitude. I mean, in the 90s, it was hard because people didn't see the need for it. Now they do see the need for it. But then again, what is the division of labor? And, clearly our government has a development capacity through AID and so forth, and it can do things, and it's very important that it does these things. But in terms of on democracy, the division of labor, in my view, needs to be that our government, and it's not just because of democracy, needs to have a policy which, frankly, establishes a kind of geopolitical stability in the world. I mean, and that's a problem that we haven't had for a long time, including in the last administration, when you had this drastic retreat after the Bush period, and there was tremendous amount of geopolitical instability in the world, and with autocrats moving in to fill vacuums. And so you need that framework of stability, and which frankly we don't have that today, but we haven't had it for a while, and it's a very, very dangerous period. But that's one thing that's needed. Democracy needs that in order to evolve, and our government our government, especially the U.S., has to play the leadership role in doing that. And in addition to that, and we've heard this from a lot of people in our foreign service, ambassadors, that when they're in countries, they can and should see it as their role to use their influence to try to keep space open for the people that we work with and the people that we support. And they can do that. And we've had some terrific ambassadors. Some of them have served on our board who've talked about that as to how the U.S. embassies and the U.S. influence can play that role. And finally, look, we need to articulate a message to the world, a vision. The way Reagan did in the Westminster address, that is the address and it's a brilliant address even to go back to, but it really does express the values that this country stands for, and I think this country still stands for. So if you have a perspective like that, then the NED comes in to really nurture and support the people on the ground, and it's really not that exorbitant a process, not that expensive a process, because without the activists, without these movements on the ground, nothing would be possible. But because they're there and because they can develop, that's how democracy develops, and this is what we have to do. And it's my view that these activists, and they're really all over the world. I mean, what I want to, this is an institution, CSID, that is focused on basically the Arab Middle East, but maybe the Muslim world a little bit more generally. But I really want you to understand that what I talked about with Algeria and Sudan is going on in many, many other countries today. So that we have, in Ethiopia, in Armenia, in Malaysia. The transition in Ukraine is incredibly important and is extremely threatening to a fellow like Putin, who worries very much about having a democratic Ukraine right across this border. And they've got a young, reform-oriented president, and the Ukraine transition is going well. It's taken a long time. This is going on all over the world, and it's been always my hope that that might be able to light a spark here to remind people here. And then we have to, how do you then make the connection to people here and the people on the ground in these struggles? Like in Hong Kong today, I mean, nowhere, this is really having, I think, an impact on world opinion, not only how China is viewed, but the fact there's been a marvelous Australian television program about the Hong Kong protests, and with extremely vivid footage, but what impressed me the most about it was one young person after another is saying, I'm ready to give my life for freedom, And when people start saying that, some people here who have forgotten what it's all about may be reminded of what it's all about. And maybe one last point is just that don't underestimate the influence of our Congress. The support for these values remains bipartisan and strong in the Congress, and we've got to nurture that. I might say, I didn't say this in my remarks, but when I got back from that conference where Ranucci gave that keynote, it was May of 2018, I had a meeting with the Republican leader in the Congress, Kevin McCarthy. And, you just had, I was just back and hearing the speech by Ranucci, and then also the elections in Malaysia that had taken place on May the 9th with this breakthrough, with the possibility that our friend Anwar Ibrahim could become the next prime minister, in a couple of years. In any event, so I said to him, that these are our friends, and it's exactly the message that I delivered here. This is the way to fight extremism, through voices like this. And he said, if you can bring any of those people here in Washington, I will convene meetings for them. I think this is the most important thing we can do. So don't underestimate that. It's bipartisan.
Thank you. We have time for 2 more questions. Yes, Peter.
Carl, thanks very much for your remarks. I wanted to engage a topic that I think I heard an echo of in Michelle's question, which is about the fact that there's been a lot of interest in the phenomenon of emerging democracies in recent years, and the idea that given some of the jadedness of the traditional American democracy promotion industry in this country, given the seeming orientation of the current administration and the difficulties the United States has as being taken seriously abroad as a country that genuinely supports democracy and human rights, I wonder whether you see the contours of a new network of potential global partners for the United States, not working on behalf of the United States, not showing up at meetings convened by the United States, that might help to kind of give a more genuinely global face to this endeavor. Obviously, with respect to countries that we think of as emerging powers that happen to be democratic, countries like Brazil and India and Turkey, they're obviously having their own problems with respect to the rise of exclusionary politics in their domestic realm. So I'm wondering, when you think about what the next half century of this looks like, and a kind of broader emerging family of nations that could help to carry this forward, what are the countries that you have your eyes on?
It's a great question, and something we're really working on at NED. And first of all, let me say that when we think about these other countries, we have to think about their civil societies as well as the governments, because this is really going to come from below: think tanks, civil societies, journalists, and others. But it's a tough. It's difficult. I mean, we have a part of our strategy now. We call it democratic unity, and it's really, and part of it, part of it's because of the retreat of our own government, but also because of the rise of China and other authoritarian powers. So how do you get the democratic world to begin to make up some of the deficits there? And countries, like India and Japan and Canada and other countries like that, South Korea. And we really are investing a great deal of effort in that. Next week, for example, there's going to be a delegation here in Washington parliamentarians from Japan, younger parliamentarians from Japan. And we've been talking with Japan literally for a quarter of a century about, can you get more involved? Can you, and they don't, they're so uneasy because of their culture, what democracy. I don't like the word democracy promotion, by the way, democracy support, because I think it all comes from within. You don't promote from without. But they think of our work as very political, and they're very careful. They'd prefer to support emerging democracies where they're invited in by the governments and so forth, but they need the institutions, they need the capacity, and they have people in the parliament who are trying to think about how to do this. So we're having a meeting a week from Friday morning, a week from tomorrow, to talk about Ned's history and how it was done here and how we've maintained bipartisan support. I know it's a different political system because that's a dominant one-party state. It's not like, the U.S., but still, there's tremendous interest in it, and they know that they have to step up a little bit. And India, too, I mean, even under Modi, I mean, we've really worked with many think tanks in India to try to, because that's so important. And we had the founding of the World Movement for Democracy 20 years ago in New Delhi because it's the world's largest democracy. And, the speech by Amartya Sen still is a great vision of how some Indians think about India's role in the world. So, I think, we just have to keep working at that. And at some point, you'll have a change here, and you might be able to put something together. And again, it has to be put together realistically, where we understand that we're not asking, the United States to do the whole job. We're asking the United States to be part of the game, and then to do the few things I said, which is not really that much, to use your voice, to use your influence, to keep the space open, and then, frankly, to have a responsible foreign policy to avoid war and to preserve stability, which is something and that's liberal world order, it's all of those things. But it can be done, and I think our community, and I consider CSID to be part of this community, have to think hard together in how to put something like that together.
One more question.
Yeah.
We have three. Can we take them together very quickly?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, quickly, please.
I'll try to be briefer.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much for your remarks. I just have a quick comment, and then would like to see your reaction. I really would hate to be in your position. That is because when we talk about democracy, we're talking about democracy without interest. Doesn't make any sense. Because when it comes to the question of being a democracy and promoting your interest, and that interest may be anti-American foreign policy, then you are on the blacklist, so to speak. So partially, I guess what can Ned, from my perspective, can do is to educate Washington about what's going on in the Islamic world. When you talk about Islam and democracy, and your remark, I think, implied that there is a closer connection between democracy and secularism, as opposed to...
Democracy and what?
And secularism.
Secularism.
Yeah, because, again, this is the tradition of the West. And
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the question is, again, how can you be a democratic state or try to be one, Islamic Republic, what have you, and try to build democracy? And of course, you're designated on the State Department blacklist, not because of what's going on inside Iran, I would say, but mostly because of Iran's foreign policy behavior. So from my perspective, I guess what Ned can do more so is to educate Washington and people in the State Department as how to, if you want to understand what's going on, you have to get your feet wet, so to speak. You have to have more forums as such in order to understand what's going on within these countries, as opposed to say, hey, this is our formula for democracy, and that is based on our experiences, and do so. Thank you.
Okay. Jim?
Dave Ottaway from the Wilson Center. Given the new wave of authoritarianism in the Arab world, in which countries are Ned-supported groups still able to operate other than in Tunisia?
Mehrangiz Kaur, thank you very much.
One of my heroes.
And thank you very much.
And her daughter, by the way.
For your rich lecture here.